So that's interesting, okay? But what that does do is it kind of describes why, as we go through projects, we lose money as we discover things in the later phase of the project. So I started to think about this in a little more detail that said, okay, so as we do these things, what's happening between ourselves and the customer? And why is it that in the late stage of a project, the customer seems to have all this power to make us do stuff? And it came down to this concept that I identified as receiver's advantage. And what I mean by receiver's advantage is that there is a very simple thing that the receiver of any service or good can do that puts the provider of that service or good on the back foot. And that is simply to say, oh, this isn't what I was expecting. So what happens in the later phase of a project, usually, is that the customer receives our solution after 6 months of us building it. They receive our solution and they say, well, that wasn't what I was expecting. This isn't good enough. This isn't what I wanted. And by saying that, they put us on the defensive because we're trying to give them the solution that they want. And I can see how that works. It doesn't make them right. Okay, so I'm not saying that their argument is right. What I'm saying is that simply by pushing back at that point in time, there's a slight advantage that they get in the negotiation because they are the receiver, and the service provider or the provider is trying to make the receiver happy, right? So that the receiver can accept what is being provided. So I wondered, I said, well, when do we become the receiver? Like, when is the service provider going to have the advantage of the receiver's advantage that they could use against the client that says, well, this isn't what I was expecting. You need to go back and fix it. And that's actually the first half of the project. That's when we do the design. When we do the design, we're asking the customer for information that we're going to use to create the design. And unfortunately, in many instances, they actually give us garbage, but yet we just take it and we just allow that to elongate the design process. So I started to really imagine a project world where we, as the service provider, took advantage of our service provider advantage, of the receiver's advantage. And I started to think to myself, why don't we use the receiver's advantage? How could we master that as a part of the journey? And the fact that we don't use the receiver's advantage for the most part when we manage our projects kind of tends to lead us towards an outcome that looks like this, right? So we don't use the receiver's advantage and the project continues with a very high kind of gross profit margin. But because the customer starts to kind of elongate design and makes us do rework in order to account for their bad data, or they don't sign off a proper design, or they just don't sign off the design at all, or whatever the issue is, we continue to discover misalignments as the project continues, and that continues to impact our margin. This is kind of what we see in real world projects today. And it's the failure on our part to use the receiver's advantage that causes the continued decline of our margin at the rate that we see it, because we're making discoveries of misalignment all the way through the project. Does that make sense? We're essentially missing the opportunity to maintain margin because of the fact that we don't use the receiver's advantage. We aren't on the front foot in the first half of the project that says, client, I asked you for this and you're not giving it to me. You are impacting the project. And then, of course, we get the late stage issues, which then continue to erode the margin because now they have the highest impact while we have the least amount of budget flexibility. Standard budget control isn't enough. And essentially what happens is the project just keeps losing margin because of the fact that we don't use the receiver's advantage to protect the margin. And of course, consuming late stage budget for early stage overruns, right, means that we consume build budget to finish the design, means that the actual build budget gets reduced so that we can build less scope. And all it's really doing is pushing the real problem, which is the customer's engagement and clarity, further into the project. Something that I learned at this point was that nothing ever stops the current stage's budget from being consumed by the future stages. Does that make sense? Nothing stops the build budget from being cannibalized by the overrun of design. And every time we allow that to occur, we actually short ourselves the ability to build the scope for the client in the later stage of the project.